Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being there in our 14th Web Minute series. And this one is on energy efficiency policy making in the emerging economies. So before in this webinar, Johanna is going to host the webinar. And then as a speaker, we have the opportunity and the privilege to have Luis Felipe Lopez, who is now working in IEA. But before we start the webinar, I would like to introduce you about Emanate. But before starting the introduction to Emanate, I would like to say belated Happy Global Wind Day for everyone who is working in the wind industry. So Global Wind Day was celebrated on the 15th of June, which was yesterday. So keep up the good work, and we wish for the fast growth in wind energy penetration, despite of the challenges and the barriers that we face from many aspects. So these first 5 minutes introductions are primarily dedicated to those who attend the webinar for the first time. Just to give a brief explanation that Emanate is a community, and we established it in the February 2018. Its main target audience are the graduates and the students of PM3E, ME3, and also the exchange students that join us in the third year in the IMT Atlantic France, or École Mines de Nantes. However, the participations from wider public are also gratefully welcome. So Emanate serves as an exchange platform among graduates to share knowledge, expertise, and experience. Emanate hopes to maintain the professional connections which were pre-established during the academic period in the master program. Using these connections, we hope to open opportunity to find synergy and collaboration. Collaboration could be found in many ways, whether it is personal, organizational, or even collaborations to start a new journey. That would be the best case. And Eminent also wishes to be the place for anyone if they want to find mentors, because we believe that with mentorship, someone could accelerate their skill and therefore also their professional growth. Last but not least, Eminent also believes that each of us is responsible for the impact we create in our daily life, and therefore Eminent encourage a sustainable lifestyle amongst its members. So, as an example, we share content on sustainable lifestyle through our newsletters. So for now, our main activities still are on webinars, where the graduates or the students present their internship projects or professional projects. And if you come here for the first time, if you haven't got into our social media pages and groups, please feel free to come and join. We are there on LinkedIn, and we are also there on Facebook. And yeah, please feel free to write us email or also write posts on those pages so that we can contact you further. You can get also newsletters that we are sending every month. And still our dreams is to have podcast and website. So website will come in the next month. And then if you are also interested in joining in the making of the podcast, contributing with your expertise and your experience, you are also very welcome. In 2018, we had several webinars ranging from February to November, covering a lot of topics, and presented by mainly internship projects presented by 2017 graduates. And in 2019, up to now, we have 5 webinars organized already. And today is the 6th. And yeah, I hope that you will enjoy this webinar, and please ask questions and get involved. And this is the best time for us to get to know Luis Felipe Lopez, who's working in IEA, a reputed institutions. And if you want to get to know more about his work and his project and also these institutions, now is the best time. So yeah, I'm giving that time to Joanna.
So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are right now. I will be hosting this 14th webinar of Emanate. And well, I would like to present our speaker of today's session. He is Luis Felipe. He's graduated from ME3 program in 2018 after finishing his internship in International Energy Agency in Paris, where he's still working. As an energy analyst on the IEA, Luis is working on energy efficiency policy analysis and project coordination in emerging economies. He's happy to share with us today some insights on the case for energy efficiency as it relates to climate change goals and why emerging economies are key to this effort. So, during the webinar, Luis will be giving insights to answer these questions. Why is energy efficiency important, particularly in emerging economies? What role do energy efficiency policies play, and how are they made? And what are the difficulties in emerging economies on this topic, as well as what needs to happen? So after this seminar, we will be sending you a feedback form for you to fill it out so we enhance the webinar experiences. So we will appreciate your participation on that. And for the question and answers, you can write them in the comments sections in YouTube if you're there, or Hangouts by chat or by microphone. We will be stopping the presentation after each section is finished. The presentation is divided in three sections, so we can allow our participants to ask questions in the middle of the presentation. So now I invite Luis to start his talk and to share his screen with our audience. Thank you.
Okay, hello.
Hello, Luis. We hear you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Here's my presentation for today. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all those who organized it. My presentation is about energy efficiency policymaking in emerging economies. I stayed in Nantes. We had one semester there with Didier Boeuf from ADEME in energy efficiency, and I found it really interesting. I found a position in the IEA where I could do it. And basically, this is a summation of what I've been doing related to my master thesis as well. And I thought it was an important thing since most of us as well who did the program come from emerging economies. And I think that's really important if we understand the situation um, where we come from, the global changes that we want to see if we want to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And well, let's go. So in this presentation, uh, I'm going to talk about why energy efficiency is important, um, what are energy efficiency policies and how they are made, and then why is it exactly difficult? Why do we need to make a position specifically saying emerging economies? I will tell you about the difficulties, why that is, and what needs to happen. So first is, why is energy efficiency important? So this is probably a graph that you've probably seen. If you checked out the IEA reports, we have a new policy scenario and sustainable development scenario. New policy scenario basically means that with the current trends in energy demand and energy consumption and the way the supply is delivered, what are going to be the emissions with the current policies set by the government. And then it sees that the emissions from here on this blue line is going to reach by 2040. And then we also make another scenario, which is one that tries to reach the 2-degree goal. Now they're trying to change this to reach 1.5 degrees. But basically, if we paint that picture wherein we have less emissions, what needs to happen? How much the emissions should go? And this is what it is. And between those things, when we try to analyze what are the most cost-effective measures that we can do to reach between this point and this point, we see that the best options that we get, of course, is energy efficiency at the beginning, lowering energy demand, and hence emissions. And then, of course, the others are renewables, nuclear, etc., etc. These are the results of modeling scenario done by the IEA. And because of this, we see that there's a big importance, of course, of renewables, but more importantly, energy efficiency. And so what does this 44% contribution of energy efficiency mean? We need to check first about the sources of energy demand. And we see in 2040 that most of the energy demand would come from emerging economies: Mexico, Brazil, China, Southeast Asia, India, places wherein population is growing, population is getting rich. They have better welfare, which means they would have a higher amount of welfare needs, which are often serviced by energy consumption. People want to travel more with their cars, etc., etc., and it consumes a lot more energy. And this is the reason why energy demand is expected to grow from emerging economies, about 95% of them. So energy efficiency in these emerging economies are much more important. So developed economies in United States, in North America, in Europe, Japan, etc., they're all there, very stringent, but that's because they've already experienced this period of growth. They already know how important energy demand needs to be controlled, but still provide the same level of service. And this is something that we want to do in emerging economies because those policies are either absent or very weak. And so that's the main case of why is it important in emerging economies. We can now go to the energy efficiency policies and how they are made. But before I go on, are there any questions at the moment? No? I
We
think I
got
can.
we got not questions. You can continue.
Sorry? No
We
questions
don't,
at the moment?
no, we don't have questions by the moment.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so energy efficiency policies and how they are made. So first is, why do we need to talk about policy? And I'm gonna tell you some boring technical background, but will be useful to appreciate the next section. I'm gonna tell you about the types of policies, how we classify them, and then what is a good way to do it. Of course, we say this, what are the kinds of data and analytics to generate a good evidence base? Of course, we know that in other countries, they use different principles of how they create policies, but this is a really good way if you want uh, a kind of policy that really addresses the energy demand. So why policy? First is, if we observe the general market today, we have energy, we have environment, resources, technology, consumers, firms. These are the things that exist in our system at the moment. So, for example, if you want to demonstrate this, you have environment or resources, let's say fossil fuel, utilized by technology. It's been used by firms or producers in order to sell something to consumers, energy service, or maybe just products in general, or sometimes the technology directly being used by consumers. And so, what does this mean? Um, all this interaction happens and it generates waste back to the environment. As we can see earlier, one of the main waste that we're thinking about is the CO2 emissions. And all of these interactions are regulated. All the borderlines are done and as set up by government and institutions. So how much do we want to protect the environment? How much do we want to increase these kinds of interactions between them? It's all set by the government. What kind of framework do we want to do? How do we want actors in the market to behave? And um, this is what determines how the environment gets taken care of. And it does so, the government does so in based on its own goals: economic growth, environmental sustainability. Does it want jobs, for example, so that they get votes, for example, from your everyday consumer? These are the important things that governments need to balance, and these are the things that they need to consider when they make policies. And so one of the most important thing that we can notice is that when we talk about economic growth, these are the common, like one of the strongest goals that are important for emerging economies. And often these are the things that try to um, that are the point of dilemma for governments when they want to pursue economic growth and hence favor firms and producers and consumption of energy consumers, but at the same time they have to balance protection of the environment. So this is how like the market acts, and this is the role of the governments. How do you balance that at the beginning? So let's talk about the policies in which we could try to address that in terms of protecting the environment by energy efficiency, but at the same time provide the same welfare. So Energy efficiency policies are any policy aiming to push an economy to adopt energy efficient and energy efficient technology and or practices. So we have instruments in which we could put in a policy, and we generally classify them as information awareness instruments, economic instruments, regulatory instruments, basically saying that information means that, okay, this one is more efficient, that one is less efficient. It's up to you which to decide. Economic instrument says something like, okay, that thing is less efficient, so I'm going to tax you um, if you still want to buy that. And regulatory instrument says that, okay, that's so inefficient, I'm not going to allow you to buy it. I'm going to ban it. That's basically what it means. And it all depends on the market that we have. So the way we paint this market, whether it's going to be a free market, we have a lot of theories about that, how the market should efficiently um, develop, how much intervention, how much strength does the government need to have when it sets all these boundaries. It's all about theory, and it all dictates the kind of instruments that we want to pursue. So, for example, for information and instruments, you usually use it when the market is almost perfect and that consumers and producers just need correct information for decision making. So if we think that consumers and producers already know that more higher energy efficiency is more important, we know that we need to protect the environment, etc., etc. We just need the information, then we provide information and instruments. Sometimes when externalities are not taken into account, so for example, we want to protect the environment, but at the moment we don't know how to price and therefore be able to know what is exactly the cost. So for example, when we have air pollution, deep down the government is the one paying for it because of the hospitals, for example, hospital bills, etc., etc. And these are the things not paid for by coal power plants, for example. And so we try to calculate the cost of providing that healthcare and make sure that the coal power plants are paying for that. And so either we tax those harmful things, or we provide incentive when it's something good. So for example, we provide rebates when it's a clean technology, or we provide rebates when it's a more efficient technology. And so that's what economic instrument means. And then regulatory instruments, when we feel that the market on its own cannot make the right decisions towards the right directions, the government steps in. No matter how inefficient it will be, it directly sets what needs to happen. Often when it's urgent, often when the market cannot really feel the impacts of what will come to them. It's like you can imagine it as walking through a cliff and the government being there to stop it. So how is it delivered? So for example, in transport sector, if you want an information instrument, you will provide a fuel economy label, kilometers per liter, so that if we think that people on their own can make the right choices, then we just put a label. If not, we can also give rebates for electric vehicle. This is economic instrument. We think that electric vehicles are cleaner, more efficient, but people are not buying them, so we provide rebates. We make it cheaper for them to buy it because we give them an extra boost. Or regulatory instruments. Okay, we think that even though the cars out there are really inefficient, the consumers cannot make the right directions, and the manufacturers don't want to produce more efficient vehicles. So we put a phase out. Anything below this certain kilometer per liter, we phase out. That's regulatory. And then we see the same thing for industry. So for example, information capacity building for energy managers, or electricity taxes, or we provide energy saving obligations. All of you industries, for example, who will consume this amount of energy consumption per year, you need to reduce it. Whatever you need to do, you need to reach this target. That's what energy saving obligations mean. And in buildings, for example, we provide building labels. These are green buildings. These are not green buildings, etc., etc. Or we provide rebates for efficient appliances. If they provide a more efficient air conditioners, we put some incentives so that consumers will want to buy the more efficient ones. And of course, codes and standards. Whenever you build an appliance, whenever you produce whenever you build a building or produce an appliance, it has to have this minimum amount of energy consumption. So that's how it's delivered. And then what's a good way to do it? Before I go on with this one, are there any questions at the moment? No?
No, there are
Uh,
not questions.
Okay.
I have I don't know, maybe it will be addressed later,
Yeah.
but because energy, you said that part of one of the example is phasing out something, right? For
Yes.
example, also phasing out the old vehicle, for example.
Yes.
And my question would be whether whether the impact of phasing out vehicles is included in the while they are making the policy. You know what I mean?
Yes. So usually it gets usually the way this forms out in a legislation, you provide some kind of mandate for a certain ministry. So, for example, Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Environment, and then they get to say, um, this is the minimum amount of energy consumption, energy performance standard for a vehicle to be able to drive on the streets. And then they would provide implementing rules such that it gives the power for that ministry to take out or um, to make those regular tests, so that if your vehicle fails, it gets taken out, it gets put into it gets impounded, for example, things like
Mhm.
that. And that's how we phase out inefficient vehicles, and we make sure that the ones that get to drive on the street are the ones which are more efficient, less emissions, and as well less energy consumption for the same mobility service that it provides.
And what about the impact of these vehicles getting phased out? Like the treatment of those vehicles, are these taken into account as well?
Yeah, so normally that's like an automatic. There should be a plan for on how to phase out all those inefficient vehicles. So normally, when I say all of these things, of course, the ones that follow through are really important. So when we talk about resource efficiency, circular economy,
Yeah.
those things should follow as well, right? We don't want just like phasing out vehicles and then sending them to a poorer country or something.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
Um,
cool.
Although that's something that often happens at the moment, but of course, as we go along, we realize that it's actually a system. It's not a one-line thing. But at the moment, this is not the focus of um, where my work is. Although we're trying to slowly highlight those things that okay, once we phase out inefficient vehicles in a certain country, a proper treatment should follow as well.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's the same thing, right? Like otherwise, we're just like buying new things.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, thank you very much. Interesting.
Okay, any other questions? I will move on to the next section. What is a good way to do it? So what is a good way to do it is basically to prioritize high energy consumption, observe market conditions, and then choose policy package. Three simple things. Then I will tell you what are the kinds of evidences and analysis that we do in order to support this policy package. So first is we prioritize based on the sector, then disaggregate some more, which are the highest energy consumers. Then we look at observe the market conditions. So the actors that you see on the image that I shown before, we analyze how they act, how they behave, how they consume energy, and we observe what's the appropriate policy package that could come that would work in order to reduce that energy demand or for them to choose the more efficient products or more efficient services. So, for example, first is we need data and we need to disaggregate based on sector. So, this is an example of data evolution of energy consumption by sector in the Philippines. So, as you can see, transport sector is the biggest, residential sector is the biggest. It's mostly the same kind of trend. And what this tells us is that okay, when if we don't have any energy efficiency policies at the moment, maybe we should focus on transport and then maybe residential sector. That's basically a basic thing. And these are the reasons why we search for this kind of data. Then we can disaggregate some more because this is a very big level, right? Then we do some surveys, for example. Then we look at the details of energy consumption in the residential sector, and then we'll find out that, oh, actually, a lot of it is because of space cooling and refrigeration. And then the others are entertainment, etc., etc. This is the result of his survey. When we have that, then we can start looking at, okay, maybe we'll look at space cooling and refrigeration. Maybe we look at why they're consuming a lot on refrigeration and air conditioning, for example. Maybe we should start considering at looking at their appliances. How can we reduce that energy? So that's the main level. Prioritize the high energy consumers. Then the second is to observe the market conditions. So to observe the market conditions, we look at GDP prospects. As I told you before, the government sets how the market behaves based on its own goals, based on the interaction of the people. And so we look at things such as GDP, what has been the contribution to that. For example, agricultural industry services, like maybe is the country focusing on growth? You need to also be careful with that. So, for example, if you see how the GDP evolve, which ones are the ones contributing to your GDP? Which ones do you need to be careful? And do you think that in the future, when you start getting richer, will it be energy hungry? So normally, if you have a high share of energy intensive industries and then you think that it's going to grow, then you probably need to be careful with that because you know that it's going to be an energy intensive future. But you need to plan this out from at the moment. Then you could also look at, in terms of economic structure, how are you going to supply that future, future welfare? So a lot of it you can check with your energy security, for example. So for example, this is an evolution of energy mix and self-sufficiency in the Philippines. So you have some renewables, but you can see that the crude oil and oil product imports are increasing. And as you can see, the self-sufficiency is decreasing. So if you really want to grow and be very energy independent, you won't be able to do that if you're very energy intensive and if a lot of it are from imported fossil fuels. Moreover, when you do these things, you can also start combining it with your other societal goals, which is environmental. So if you can see that you have increasing crude oil in your energy mix, then maybe it's also counterproductive to your environmental goals. Then you can do afterwards. You can do what we call a decomposition analysis. So this is what we do. This is what I worked on last year. But basically, this is trying to analyze the factors that contribute to your energy consumption. So this is a very useful tool that is not just useful for policy analysis, could also be used for any other kinds of data analysis when you have a time series which relate to different factors. So basically, when we do a decomposition analysis, we try to analyze the structure. So for example, this is a energy consumption of industry and services in 2000 and 2017. Activity means how much more did we produce? And how did that relate to energy consumption? Structure means what is the share of energy intensive industries in our whole industry and industry and service sector. And efficiency is whether we were able to reduce the energy intensity per product produced. And by doing such kind of decomposition analysis, we'll be able to observe better how the market interacts with itself. So we can see that in the absence of energy efficiency policies, the market itself was able to do some efficiency on their own. We will observe the background behind this is that it's because of the high electricity prices. But because we're able to provide this kind of decomposition analysis, we can see how the market actually interacts with the information and the structures around them. So it allows us to question what made them take up efficiency on their own, which sector did this, what kind of policy should we do. So if we see things like this, for example, that they were able to do efficiency, then maybe we just need an instrument, an information instrument, or maybe we just need an economic instrument. These are the things that help us judge how stringent we want the policy to be. And then, of course, you do stakeholder consultations, and all of those things. We observe the market conditions. So if you all balance this, it's not quantitative, it's very qualitative. But in the end, we use quantitative analysis in order to support the qualitative judgment that we put. So then, of course, population, income, stakeholder consultations. We ask questions like, is the population growing? Maybe we should put preventative measures now, such as public transport. Is income good? Will they have enough purchasing power to pay for extra costs? So, for example, if you put economic instruments in there, you tax cars, for example, in order for them to buy more, to go to public transport, etc., etc. Will they be able to pay for that if they still want to buy a car and there's not enough public transport? Are producers able to supply more efficient products? Do they have the capacity? Do they have the resources? Are industrial consumers capable um, of shouldering the cost of higher taxes on electricity because you want them to adjust based on that? And how much power do industries have over the political decisions? So, of course, as we said before, the government sets the policies based on its goals. And if its goal, for example, is economic growth, and at the same time you only have one really strong industry that can provide you that economic growth, then maybe when you do the stakeholder consultations, when you try to negotiate with that manufacturer in order to lower his or her energy consumption, then it's going to be difficult. Then you maybe want to balance with just an information, maybe just an economic instrument, and maybe when you have more power, then you do some regulatory instruments. So what the first way in order to choose the policy package is to do a cost benefit analysis. So this is the McKinsey greenhouse gas abatement curve. It's a good decision making tool because you can see how um, how each packages can save a lot. So this is measured in cost per ton of emissions abated. You can also do the same thing for emissions per energy saved. But as you can see, like each option would have a different choice. Uh, e- each each investment would carry different energy saving benefits, and so you can prioritize the amount of effort that you put in versus the energy that you save. This is a very important thing. And then the most important is as well is to consolidate all the analyses that you did. So what's an example of consolidation to support your policy? So as we saw in the example of the Philippines, for example, you first prioritize. Okay, transport's the largest energy consumer. 70% is fossil fuel by fossil fuel passenger cars. Then you observe the market. The population is growing. Mobility is important to go around the cities. Fossil fuel is mostly important, and people drive less when prices are high. The automobile industry has strong lobbying powers, and the government does not have enough money. Um, so, what's a good policy package? Okay, because fossil fuel is people drive less when prices are high. We think that the consumers are informed. So let's do vehicle labeling to inform. But at the same time, even if you want to push manufacturers to provide more efficient products, it's very hard because they have strong lobbying powers. So maybe at the moment we don't want to put on taxes. Maybe at the moment we just want vehicle labeling. Then we invest in the long term for public transport. So at least we're not directly going against the automobile industry, but we're investing on public transport so we regain power. And then afterwards, then we start putting some taxes on automobile industry, or we start telling them that we need to phase out inefficient cars. So that's how we usually consolidate things in order to come up with a policy package. So what are the difficulties in emerging economies? I will tell you in the next section, but at the moment, are there any questions?
Yes, I have some questions.
Yeah,
Um, okay, so what's the typical time horizon
yeah.
in which you analyze the market or the economy forecast?
So okay, so that will be a difficult thing. So normally, I will touch a little bit on it on why it's difficult for emerging economies. But normally, projects like this, you do forecasts like that within a matter of months. Only if your economic teams have models. Some countries have their own development think tanks. They're the ones who make economic policy forecast on a yearly basis. So they finish all of those things, do peer reviews, etc., etc. Do they do a lot of surveys with manufacturers, producers, etc., etc., and they do it every year, and they create an economic outlook. So then you can understand the um, how the market would be and how might the energy involve. So that happens within a period of less than a year, but it's done by a big team.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um, and can you go to slide 16? 16?
16.
Yeah. Okay, so for this, can you explain this again? I mean, how do
Yeah,
you go from the 2000 consumption to the 2017, and actually
yeah.
what those uh,
Bars in.
bars, yeah, mean because they seem to go from
Yeah,
800. Let's say I don't want to go to the
yeah,
numerical
yeah,
details like 600 something,
yeah.
but why did they have do you have that
A
axis
value. Yeah,
stay there?
yeah. So I can explain. So the 2000 energy consumption. This is if we compare 2000 energy consumption and 2017 energy consumption of the industry and services sector in the Philippines. This is like the final energy consumption that they have.
Okay.
But at the moment, with just numbers, these are just the information that we have. It evolved from 2000 to 2017. The decomposition analysis is to add additional data to see, such as how much products that were produced during that time, how it changed over time, and their relation to the product produced versus the energy consumption per product produced. When we plug that in using a formula that I'll be happy to explain in another presentation, we can see how uh, we can determine the response the share of activity. So activity, for example, 2000. If if we just produce the same amount in 2017 with no efficiency improvements, the energy consumption would be this high because we're just looking at the activity. So how much energy consumption was driven by activity was driven by more products produced. So it pushed up this high. And then structure is about in your whole industry and services, how much are the share of iron and steel, which is like energy intensive, or services, which is very non-energy intensive. So it pushed it up a little bit more, which means there's slightly between 2000 and 2017, there's slightly a higher share of energy intensive industries that entered this sector. So it pushed it up a little bit more, and then the rest was that, okay, how much efficiency happened between 2000 and 2017, and this is the amount of efficiency that was responsible between industry and services. And so when you add all of those together, that's why you reach this level. That's why in 2017 we had this much of energy consumption. But during those periods, we were able to produce much more because we were able to undertake some form of energy efficiency measures. So we will see that for certain countries which had a lot of efficiency gains, we will see that they had a surprising amount of activity, but their efficiency was somewhere here, which means they become really, really energy efficient, and then their final consumption will just be somewhere here, which means that they were able to satisfy a big amount of welfare, a big amount of economic growth when they had this, but in the end, the energy consumption stayed roughly the same way. It depends on the sector, depends on the country, but ideally, this is what we want to have for a lot of economies. We want them to have a lot of welfare, a lot of wealth, growth, etc., without really increasing the energy consumption. So that is what we want to have, and we can demonstrate it when we do analyses like decomposition.
Okay, thank you. I think that term is like decoupling,
Yeah,
yeah, economic growth from energy consumption. So we have a question from YouTube from
yeah.
Marco Dan.
Hmm.
On the data available, what is usually the collection process? Uh,
The, yeah.
does it usually rely on what the government can provide, or is there a phase for running, for example, a market assessment?
Yeah, so that's the integral part of my third section. I can get to that later, but is there any other question before we?
I have a question.
Yeah.
On slide number 19, if I'm not wrong,
Hmm.
can you please go to slide 19?
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. On this slide, you talk about a good way could be to consolidate
Yeah.
support to policy. That is, you talk about the increasing prices because people drive less when prices are
Hmm.
high. You talk about a long-term public transport policy and
Yeah.
lobbying powers of automobile and everything.
Yeah.
But how do you put these policies or policy making in relation or in respect to the actual situation? For example, in respect to the purchasing power of the population,
Hmm.
because you cannot have a policy where the fuel prices are high when the purchasing power is low. We saw very good examples of this not working out in France in the last 6 months, and the situations could get worse in developing economy where the public transportation system does not exist. So
Hmm. Hmm.
do these policies or do these forecasts take into account, and if so, how the well, there can be other aspects, but most importantly, the purchasing power and the acceptance of the policy by the public.
Yes. Yes. So that's exactly one of the main things that are plaguing economists now. There's a big debate there of how economists are not able to take account other things that they could measure as economists. So, for example, sentiments by people. So, a lot of the Gilets jaunes protest in France right now is because of the fossil fuel tax. Because if you look at the model, if you look at the economic theory, that if you tax it, then they will use it less, but then if you tax it too much, then maybe you're actually triggering other things that are not just related to the economic structure, but more onto their views of social equality. So when we relate it to purchasing power of people, so that is something that you need to check. Yes, for example, population is growing, the mobility is important, they're getting richer, but if they still don't have purchasing power, then maybe you don't want to put an economic instrument that aims to tax less efficient vehicles. Maybe you don't want to do that because, as you can see now, they're really mad when fossil fuel gets when the global fossil fuel prices gets high. For example, they can't drive more, and they drive less, and that's why I said, like, you just put them a vehicle labeling so that when they buy their cars, they buy the most efficient one, because they know that um, you know that if you start taxing, if you the less efficient ones, then maybe they won't be able to actually do it. And then as well, you know how to invest for the long term as well, because this is public transport. When you have public transport, it's always more efficient in terms of um, delivering the mobility service to the same amount of people for less energy consumption, and frankly less cost as well. It's just that a high capital cost at the beginning. I don't know if I answered your question properly.
Yes, yes, you do. For me, I really like the idea that, or the fact, right, that the economists need to take into account the fact of the
Yeah.
feedback of the people on their policies,
Yes.
which I'm not sure really exists right now.
Yeah. So a lot of economists try to do some kind of modeling when they sometimes, if it's the model is not good enough, they won't. And sometimes a model is just a model, but basically they do something like, if this is the purchasing power of the of this amount of people who drive, we think that we can push taxes more, something like that. But sometimes those models are wrong, or maybe those models are not robust. Maybe this section of people can handle an extra cost, but maybe they've already handled extra cost before, and this one is more of a symbolic gesture for them. It's something that you cannot measure, but if you're if you are more politically savvy, you know that this is something that you should avoid. So, and you should provide other options instead of pursuing the economic instrument for that period of public policy change that you want. Okay, let's go to the third, and I will answer the question by Marco. The difficulty in emerging economies, first, is the lack of evidence-based policymaking. For example, in a lot of emerging economies, they focus on re-election. Voters are often not evidence-oriented. And sometimes, due to urgency and availability of good evidence, they rely on intuition. So a lot of mayors, for example, a lot of national candidates, in fact, often become populist, and they just ride on the sentiment, no matter how ineffective the policy that they want to provide. And that's because they feel that there's an urgency to change things, even if that change is not really good. And at the same time, because you need to understand that they often focus on re-election, and if the voters themselves are really just riding on the sentiment rather than evidence, then it gets very hard for decision makers to do so. And we see this very often in emerging economies. The other thing is that energy efficiency is not in the agenda. They really have an extensive focus on growth, and which is very important because a lot of emerging economies, the people are in poverty. Of course, you need to provide growth for them. Of course, you need to provide welfare for them. But it takes them a while to realize how energy efficiency can provide um, the same welfare and services without having to sacrifice the other goal that they have, which is the climate link. So a lot of the emerging economies we see are actually really concerned about climate change, and they really want to work hard to pursue their climate goals. But often, if you they don't realize how much energy efficiency can bring the same thing, bring welfare to your people, but at the same time not hurt your climate goals. And then the rest, the third one is the lack of data to support policymaking. So even if there's interest in evidence-based policymaking, even if there's interest in energy efficiency in their agenda, the energy efficiency policymaking could be filled with assumptions due to lack of data. So to answer Marco's point, yes, a lot of these things don't exist in emerging economies. Sometimes they don't have enough data. They just weren't able to set up statistical institutions to record energy consumption, activity that results to energy consumption, what are the fuels used. Sometimes they just don't have those kinds of data. And these are things that are often stimulated by international organizations, by NGOs, maybe by universities. They try to do those things to start getting it up, and then it becomes taken up by the statistical authority, for example. Then the statistical authority does this on a regular basis. But it's a long path. The developed economies have been starting taking records even before World War One, and so record taking has been a practice. And energy efficiency since 1970s has been a priority as well. So they started taking much more disaggregated data, how energy is consumed, et cetera, et cetera. They have more interest and they've formalized it. That's why it's very easy to generate policy based on data in developed economies, but it's very hard to do the right one in emerging economies, specifically because of that. So what needs to happen? First is the lack of evidence-based policymaking. We need to provide a general promotion of evaluation, what works and what doesn't. We can encourage universities to develop and publish case studies on policies. We provide an open environment for failures. We should not criticize. We should be able to take case studies in a lot of policies, whether they work and why they didn't work. And those things should be published equally the same. So if we did like a survey of case studies on policies, not just energy efficiency policies, but just policies in general, you'll see more that in developed economies they have a lot of case studies of what worked and what didn't. It's because universities, a lot of research institutes, they just publish these things, and it gives like a big um, information base for government policymakers to do the best kind of policy for the next period. This is not the same thing for emerging economies. In emerging economies, not many people publish case studies, even though there has been a lot of cases wherein the policy worked and cases wherein the policy failed. And because there's a lack of case studies in general, even if NGOs or international organizations or the governments themselves want to help, they don't have the history, and so they are at risk of committing the same mistake again. And so when we encourage universities to develop on their own, publish it, then we increase the evidence base. Second is energy efficiency not in the agenda. We explore what needs to happen is to explore and promote multiple impacts of energy efficiency policies. We quantify, we link with other goals. We tell them that if you make all your light bulbs, for example, into LED, then you save this much amount of energy, you reduce greenhouse gases, and it's actually cheaper. So you can you can hit two birds with one stone. The more we give that kind of messaging, the more average policymakers would begin to understand to explore energy efficiency as an option first when they try to make their policy. Instead of suddenly investing in a new power plant, maybe they would consider efficiency options for appliances so that maybe they don't have to provide a new power plant. And then last is to lack of data to support policymaking. Here I would explain the importance of ICT at the moment. So we hear a lot of digitalization case studies right now, how digitalization is changing the energy system, but basically it's about taking advantage of ICT for cheaper data generation. So it's very hard for emerging economies to create regimens of data collection, to have their statistical authorities conducting surveys, etc., etc. But sometimes we can create the same data through ICT. So when you have RFID, for example, when you make it a very cheap thing to put RFIDs on cars, for example, when you link it to tollways, then at the same time, you can have an easy source of data of how cars are driven, the kilometers driven, etc., etc. So you know the activity of your transport sector. Things like that, very cheap as compared to an old way of data recording, which you take account, you do surveys on cars, you do registration systems, etc., etc., and things that are afforded that can be afforded by developed economies, but not so much by emerging economies. But now, when you have ICT, then you can explore this data, and then you can create better policy with the data. And at the same time, data is also in the form of case studies. Anytime, as long as you can explore any kind of data, any publication, case studies, just publish it. It supports the data. It supports the evidence base of your policymakers. And as what I found out while working in my role right now is that there's a lot of emerging economies, a lot of government policymakers in emerging economies who really want to do good, but they don't have enough data to support, to convince people who may have a lot of power over them. If you can provide them how much, for example, how much a certain industry is actually harming the environment, and how there's a lot of case studies that support that, then you provide help to your policymakers in order to make a stronger case. Maybe give power to your government policymakers to pursue regulatory measures. But that all happens if they have easy access to good quality data. And the more we have good quality data by universities, by just individuals publishing those data, then you make it easier for government policymakers to provide a strong case to pursue that. And that's what needs to happen. And that's my presentation. Are there last set of questions?
Thank you very much, Luis. This has been a very interesting presentation.
Mhm.
And actually, I do have some questions, and I hope our panel here may ask some more. I would like to highlight the importance of ICT. I
Mhm.
think this can be a game changer for emerging economies,
Mhm.
given the penetration of mobile phones and all these electronic devices and sources of information in terms of data. Because as you mentioned, like if developing economies are collecting energy efficiency data from the 60s, we are talking about 60 years of delay for
Mhm.
the. It seems like something that can't be updated at any point for the emerging economies. But I think the information technologies, the internet, the big data, or everything that is going on now in terms of data can really be an important leap for for collecting this information. Do you have any further insight on this, on how the International Energy Agency is considering the impact of the
Yeah.
ICT on this?
Yeah. So back in 2017, we had a publication on called Digitalization and Energy. So basically exploring all the smart technologies and how they affect the energy system. We have a publication that, and at the moment, all our divisions in the agency um, are exploring digitalization in our market reports. So by 2019, I think by October or November, our energy efficiency market report will have a feature on how digitalization, ICT, is going to change how we would consume energy, how wow, what are the aspects that can help us smartly manage an energy efficiency policy program, how we are going to how we're going to provide better services with smart better services more efficient with using smart technologies, and this is going to be the same way this is going to be the same lens by which we look at other things. So for example, even in renewable energy, even in other aspects of the energy system, we will start exploring those things. So yeah, you can watch out for that as we start publishing it in the coming months. Um, but yeah,
Okay.
that is an area of priority for us. We would always start looking at um, smart technologies because we know how they it becomes easier, especially for emerging economies, to do the things that were too expensive for them before, and as a result provide a good evidence base for policy or good um, ways to actually implement energy efficiency program just because you have smart technology. So for example, instead of having private cars, it's always to do car sharing, and car sharing is way easier just because, and it's only enabled because you have ICT, because you can have apps um, that enable that. So that's one thing that you have a lot of um, other examples of how it allows emerging economies to do significant energy efficiency measures enabled by cheap ICT.
Great. And I think it's on the side of the measurement, on the side of tracking,
Mhm.
and getting like almost like instantaneous effect of what is going on
Mhm.
after a policy, for instance,
Mhm.
can also help reviewing policies and improving policies in a more frequent periods, like yearly or so, and instead of like every 5 or 4 years to change a policy. And we have some questions from the YouTube audience from Fatima Melgar. In the context of the difficulties that developing countries face to include energy efficiency in their agenda or generate evidence based policies, what is the role of organizations like IEA?
Mhm. So as IEA. So IEA is basically an intergovernmental association of countries belonging to the OECD, aka rich countries. But it recognizes that because the main goal is energy security for everyone, it starts engaging emerging economies. At the moment, we're engaging big emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, etc. And so it does. In terms of like promoting the evidence base, we develop partnerships with emerging economies, and we start discussing them ways on how we can help them in their energy efficiency agenda. So we have discussions with them. We try to say, okay, why is this not in your priority? We think that this should be in your priority. We highlight situations where case studies as well, wherein they could achieve the same amount of welfare but using less energy. And then we also provide support whenever they need like case study on something, or maybe to develop a study on a specific sector that they don't have the capacity for. Then we provide that kind of capacity to them. It changes depending on the country that we're dealing with. So for example, China is a huge emerging economy, but they've already done a lot on energy efficiency. They've achieved tremendous amount of growth without the equivalent energy, with less um, with less energy consumption, as compared to how United States, Europe, and Japan developed in a very and which was a very energy intensive thing. So of course, because they already have that kind of capacity, we don't really need. Uh, I mean, they already know what to do if you think about it. So we explore other ways by which we can further strengthen. Um, whatever they need. Of course, in other emerging economies, ones that are smaller, then we will need to provide more support. Maybe something more basic, maybe more of communication and messaging about why energy efficiency is important. So it depends. It depends, and we try to adapt our strategies based on that.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Marco, and it is related to the how the IEA and the governments work.
Mm-hmm.
So all this process where the IEA gets involved with a government,
Mm-hmm.
it is usually a process that uh, is part of a national project requested by the government of the country, or is
Yes.
it like an ongoing work from the IEA as part of the IEA mandate?
So the IEA is a it's an independent organization, and it's usually requested by so usually national governments have their own project, their own policy, and they just ask the IEA to do this because the IEA has the technical capacity to do so. So these kinds of things are usually requested by national governments. So let's say um, a certain government really wants to work on hydrogen, for example, Japan, then it will ask the IEA, okay, what about looking at the hydrogen technology, etc., etc., do some kind of analysis. What are the best ways by which a certain country could enter the hydrogen market or strengthen the hydrogen um, market, things like that. That is how IEA acts with its member countries and partner countries. It's usually initiated by um, the government countries, and the mandate is just for the IEA to respond to this kinds of requests.
Okay, thank you very much. And well, I will have like a last question from my side, and I don't know if someone else from our Hangouts have another question. I think that part of this framework that you explained on how policies are made,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I was wondering about let's say the McKinsey framework. It is only referring to the CO2 generated by the certain yes, the CO2 mitigated by a certain change. But also, I think this should be more thorough, because I think only CO2 is not the only indicator for, let's say, environmental impact. For
Yeah.
climate change, yes, it's a very good indicator, but changes can also alter other use of natural resources or generate different type of waste. And I think this should all be included. I don't know if this is just one example of the frameworks that you use, or is this the
Yeah.
only one? And
So yeah.
also, sorry, and also for I see that you, like, the analysis goes from the industry, like the demand, right? Like the industry, or whatever sector demand, energy demand,
Mhm,
then how this can be lowered through
mhm,
energy efficiency, then this McKinsey, and then, but I think the social framework, which is something that I think Nipun asked earlier,
mhm,
should be tried to also being studied, um, like with a very detailed framework that like try to play with all the variables related to the social, because some of these policies can mean, for instance, if you this is not the case because it's not energy efficiency, but for instance, if you close a coal power plant, then you need to look at what are you going to do with the workers of that
mhm.
power plant, let's say. So for any energy efficiency policy, there could be like a side effect that might be negative at some point, and I would like to see if there is something clear about this.
Yeah. So I agree. So first is yes, this is just an example of a cost benefit analysis. So normally we just don't focus on one. So for example, this CO2, but ideally we would want to have different kinds of graphs which try to see the cost benefit analysis towards the different goals of a certain country. So yes, this is one climate goal, reduction of CO2, but then normally it's also looking at the cost benefit analysis with regard to employment, or to um, to the to other aspects such as energy security. So for example, maybe it's way cheaper, but then as a result you get to import more. So if you really want to be independent, energy independent, then that kind of defeats the purpose. So when we put cost benefit analysis, we would ideally want uh, different lenses, and this is just one of the lens, just CO2. And in terms of the jobs, so when I mentioned about multiple benefits of energy efficiency, um, so um, that's something that we recognize as part of the part of the social aspects that are often on the agenda of policymakers. So, for example, yes, you close down a coal power plant, you don't provide jobs for people who need jobs, and they're your voters. And so we know that that's very important. And when we try to promote energy efficiency policy, we also try to show how energy efficiency policies could generate jobs, in fact. So, for example, if you have a requirement to retrofit buildings, so in the colder countries, for example, retrofitting, providing insulation, it provides a lot of jobs, green jobs actually, which are more sustainable. And that's a very important thing. And that kind of hits the social framework that governments need to consider when they're putting on policy. So, of course, our expertise at the moment is more on energy consumption, um, some economic aspects, things that we can measure. But yes, there is a room wherein you would have a social framework that it's more qualitative, but nonetheless very important in order to make our policy robust. So we don't forget about the things that we cannot measure. We could not measure whether the workers are happy, whether the workers feel that the policy is fair or not. These are things that we cannot measure, but need to be considered. But of course, I am not an expert on that. I can't provide you what kind of social framework that is, but normally governments, policymakers, they have that in their team. And if they don't have that, well, that's one of the recommendations we will say. Maybe you should have that in your team.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think there is no further questions in YouTube and nor in our audience in
Yeah.
Hangouts. So, well, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation and for the time dedicated to our community, Liz.
Yep.
We are very pleased with this content, and I don't know if Astu wants to mention something else to close this session.
Yeah, I would like to say thank you very much. The presentation was really good and very informative. And probably we will look it up later about the decomposition analysis and how that can be useful for other fields. And but thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Well,
And
thank
yes,
you very much. Yeah, looking forward. Yeah.
please remember to check a link that we shared on YouTube for your feedback. And it's very important to us to see your appreciation of these activities.
Well, thank you very much. I was happy to share my time, and thanks for organizing this thing. I think this is a really good way to organize the community of people interested in energy and environment. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.